So in this section, we have talked about modern JavaScript development practices, such as tooling and modules. Now, since this is a section about how to write modern JavaScript, let's actually finish the section by reviewing clean and modern JavaScript coding style, and also take a brief look at some functional JavaScript principles in the next video. And this lecture is actually mostly going to be a review lecture. So a lecture where I'm going to bring together all the clean and modern JavaScript techniques and practices that I've been showing you throughout the course. And so with this, you will then have all this information in one place. Then in the next lecture, we will actually bring some of these topics to practice by fixing a bad coding example that does not follow these practices. But anyway, let's now get started. So one of the most important things when you code is that you should write readable code, which basically means that you should write code so that others can understand it, and also so that you can understand it yourself in the future. Also, you should try to avoid writing too clever and maybe overcomplicated solutions that might make you feel really smart as a developer, but which also might make your code very confusing and unreadable. And so in many situations, it's best to simply write the most straightforward solutions. Another thing that's very important for readable code is to give functions and variables very descriptive names. So for variables, you should name them according to what they contain, and for functions, you should name them according to what they do. And so by doing this, you will make it really clear and obvious to everyone what each variable is and what each function does. Next, there are some more general rules that you should follow in order to write modern and clean code, which are to use the dry principle, so don't repeat yourself, which means that you should essentially refactor your code whenever you can. Also, you should not pollute the global namespace and instead encapsulate your data into functions or classes or modules. Also, you shouldn't use var for declaring variables, right? So I've mentioned this one many times in the course, and so by now you already know that you should always use const, and only if you want to change any variable, then use let, but never var. And finally, you should always use strong type checks. So always use the triple equals over the simple double equals, which do not perform type checks. Now, about writing functions, which is one of the most important things that we do as JavaScript developers, the main rule that we should follow by writing functions is that each function should usually only do one thing. All right? Now, many times, of course, we will want to break that rule, but in general, it's good to keep this rule in mind so that you always write like small functions which only do one thing, but do it really well. All right? Next, you shouldn't use more than 3 parameters in a function. And this actually goes in line with the previous guideline because, of course, if a function only does one thing, then probably it doesn't need so many parameters in the first place. Also, use default parameters in your functions whenever that's possible, and in general, return the same data type as you received. So for example, if you receive 2 or 3 numbers as an input to a function, then probably you will want to return a number as well. So that then makes more sense for when you consume, so for when you use the function later. And again, this is a rule that you can of course break, but it's again good to keep this one in mind. Finally, you can and should use arrow functions whenever they make the code more readable, okay? And here, many people actually have different opinions. So some people started to use arrow functions everywhere, and some people don't like them at all because they think that they completely make code unreadable no matter when they're used. But personally, I like to kind of follow a middle ground. So I still use the more regular functions in many situations, but if arrow functions make the code more readable, then I will totally use arrow functions. And one great use case, in my opinion, is in the callback functions of array methods. And now, after functions, our next topic is object-oriented programming. And in my opinion, in order to implement OOP in JavaScript, you should now use ES6 classes. And so that's also what I did after our OOP section, right? Now, when designing your classes, make sure that you encapsulate any data that shouldn't be accessible from the outside so that you don't mutate that data from outside the class. All right. Now, probably you will still need to at least manipulate some data that's in the class, but for that, you should then implement a public API, so basically a couple of methods that can then manipulate that data exactly as you want that to happen. And again, we talked about all of this already before. So this is really just a review of all these big topics that we have been handling throughout all of this course. Now, as you implement your methods in your classes, make sure that you implement chaining in all the methods where it actually makes sense, because this can make your methods way easier to use, not only for you, but maybe also for other developers on your team. So this is yet another great practice when you are writing your classes. Finally, one important thing to also mention here is that in regular objects, when you're writing methods, then please don't use the arrow functions there, because by doing that, you will not get access to the this keyword of that object. Remember? And so always avoid arrow functions, even if you're not even using the this keyword in a method, because simply by getting into the habit of avoiding arrow functions as methods in this situation, you will then not commit any mistakes ever. All right? Okay. Next up, let's talk about avoiding nested code. So writing nested code, which basically means writing code inside of blocks, inside of other blocks, is really, really bad for readable code. And so we should avoid nested code at all costs. And one great way of avoiding nested code is to use guard clauses, as we have been doing over the last couple of sections, right? So guard clauses basically simply means to use an early return in case some condition is not met. Also, you can use the ternary operator or even logical operators instead of an if statement, because the ternary operator, of course, does not create a new code block, while the if statement does. Now, if you really do need an if statement, then instead of an if-else statement, you should use multiple ifs instead, because again, this will make code a lot more readable than having to go through all these if and else if and else blocks. So that's also another modern practice that we start to see more and more in modern JavaScript code bases. Next, you should completely avoid any kind of loops. And with that, I mean any for loops. So the for and also the for off loops should be avoided if you want to avoid nested code. And so instead, you can use array methods like map, filter, and reduce. And finally, you should avoid callback-based asynchronous APIs whenever you can. And so that actually brings us to our next topic, which is asynchronous code. So for best readability, always consume promises using async await and not using the then and the catch methods, because these methods actually require callback functions, which will then introduce even more nested code. And so that's, again, something that we really want to avoid. All right? So these two go kind of together. So avoiding callback-based asynchronous APIs and instead opting for using promises and then consume these promises with async await. Now, something that's very important is that whenever you can, you should run promises in parallel using the promise.all combinator function. So when you have two promises that can run at the same time, so promises that do not depend on each other, then please run them in parallel to make the application a little bit faster for your users. And finally, always handle errors and promise rejections. So this is simply a best practice for clean code. Now, right. So these are the main best practices for writing modern and clean JavaScript code that I can think of. And so let's now put some of these guidelines that I gave you for clean and modern code in practice.